Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Clara
and Carolina, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on materialism and dualism.
So interesting.
So we're going to be discussing today consciousness and mind versus matter, and whether consciousness can be described in terms of matter or something else.
Yes.
So I'll start by outlining why consciousness is a huge problem for us to understand
Yeah,
as humans.
and as neuroscientists.
Yes. So consciousness is made up of many different aspects, and some parts of it are seemingly easier to understand than others. So neuroscientists are trying to tackle parts of consciousness that we are able to study using experiments, like behavior and interoception to a certain extent, although it's also limited.
Yes, and sleep studies and
Yes, and studies with altered states of consciousness, like drugs and anesthesia and
as well as coma.
yes.
Yeah.
And so, David Chalmers, who's a famous Australian philosopher, he conceptualized these problems that are being addressed by neuroscientific research as the seemingly easy problem.
Yes.
Although we would argue against that and say that they're not easy.
It's the not so easy problem
Yes.
of consciousness.
And in 1995, David Chalmers conceptualized what is now known as the hard problem of consciousness, which is hard or difficult to understand because it is the subjective experience of consciousness, meaning the phenomenon that there is something it is like to be them.
I think it's also termed in that way because it talks about how we are limited through our intellectual abilities as well as the scientific and physical tools at our disposal, and that we can never actually answer the question of what is consciousness. It's beyond our means intellectually as well as scientifically.
Yeah.
And it is inherently impossible because you can't explain, a first person perspective from a third person perspective. There's something very unique about the experience of being human and of being conscious.
Yes, and it's a very inaccessible state except for our own consciousness. We cannot access consciousness of others, other beings.
Which is also a very solipsistic dilemma.
Yes. Yeah, so the solipsistic dilemma is that we can't be sure that any other consciousnesses actually exist other than our own.
Yeah, this could all just be a simulation or a dream.
Yeah.
The result of fantasies coinciding with reality, as said by Frith.
A hallucinated reality.
Yes.
So David Chalmers' solution to this is his view, which is known as property dualism. So dualism is the belief that matter is different to mind.
Yes, and that
So
the mind is non-physical,
yeah.
and that matter is physical,
Yeah.
and they causally interact.
Yes. So Descartes is the first person who really thought this.
Yes.
I suppose. But his view was known as substance dualism, so it's that mind and matter are different substances. Chalmers' view, property dualism, is similar, but it's that the mental properties are different from physical properties, so both kinds can be possessed by the same thing, such as the brain, but they're still distinct in terms of their properties.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, you know me, I'm a very big fan. Well, I like dualism because...
Shock for neuroscientists.
I know, it is. Well, my issue with materialism, let's start there.
Yes.
Is that it makes a lot of assumptions, and eliminative materialism especially, they believe that all neuroscience and physical properties can explain first-person experiences, which doesn't really make sense. For example, if instead of simply changing the terminology of the way we talk about phenomenological experiences won't make it reductive. So, for example, if a child falls over and he says, "Mom, I'm in pain or like, ow, it hurts, if we change the terminology to teach the child to say, oh, these neurons are firing, my amygdala is activated, this won't stop the pain experience that he's having. So simply changing the terminology or trying to make it reductive, I think, doesn't merit materialism with that high of a standing.
Yes. Yeah.
And
wow, what I was just imagining, what a world that would be. Oh no, my amygdala.
Yes. Yeah. I was also just picturing that.
Yeah, but yes, I think the problem stems from this concept of the sense of what it is like to experience something, or the qualia of an experience, which is, how would you define qualia? Like,
qualia, I think it's sensations, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is something dualism accounts for, but materialism doesn't. So it accounts for the feeling of pain and pleasure and happiness and very abstract concepts that you can't reduce down to a molecule or a neural pathway.
Yeah, I think the easiest way that I like to think about qualia is with color. So, and there's a really good thought experiment that explores this. Okay, so qualia in terms of color would be like the thing that happens when you experience a color.
When you see a color.
When you see a color, yeah. But okay, there's a thought experiment known as Mary's room, and it involves a girl called Mary who lives in a room with no color, and she learns all about the color red.
She learns all of its properties.
Yes, and all the science of how it works and its wavelength and everything there is to know about red.
Yes. But she's never seen red.
Exactly. Key point. So when she leaves the room and eventually sees red, the question is, does she have a different experience of red? Does her conceptualization of red and her conscious experience of it change?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think absolutely yes.
So for dualists, it's like easily, well, yeah.
For materialists, it's harder.
It's more difficult. So, I mean, I would argue, I feel like I have to do a disclaimer, disclaimer for future me as well, that my beliefs are subject to change.
Yeah, same here.
And very much in flux, and none of it is solid.
Yes.
Okay, now we can proceed. Okay, so in terms of Mary's room, as a neuroscientist, and somebody, I'm not a materialist per se.
Yeah.
I will address what view I resonate with most later, but I do think that Mary will have a different experience of red, of course, but it can still be attributed to the physical sensation of experiencing the color red through the pathways that are stimulated in her brain.
Okay, but reading about the wavelengths of the color red and knowing about all of its properties and the way it reflects and all of these things, and then seeing red, it's a completely different phenomenology experience.
Yes.
So I don't think the two are comparable. I agree that yes, of course, the visual system is taking in that information, but the key difference is about the experience and the phenomenon.
I think that a major flaw in this thought experiment is that it really has to do with difference between experience and knowledge.
Yes.
So the premises are Mary knows all of the physical facts there are to know, but Mary does not know all of the facts. And so the physical facts does not equate to all the facts about red because of this thing, qualia of red. So I think that this is clearly an epistemological gap.
Yes.
Because it's a difference in the way of knowing.
Yeah, and in a way of experiencing.
Yes. So for dualism, an epistemic gap means that there is also an ontological gap. So a gap in the nature of things between matter and non-material phenomenon.
But wait, do materialists account for those ontological experiences, and do they recognize and validate the non-matter and qualia-like experiences? Because from what I understand of materialism is it's all matter. It's all matter. And so
I believe in the ability for what we perceive as non-material phenomena to emerge from material mechanisms.
that may be true, and I will not argue for or against it, but I think at least eliminative materialism believe it's all due to matter. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah. So there's a view, emergentism, which was conceptualized by C.D. Broad, among others. And this is the view that different components, which are of the same kind, so let's say A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And they also are related to each other in the same way. The relation they have with each other equals R.
Okay.
So according to this view, the characteristic properties of the whole, which is A, B, and C combined by R.
So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah. And also this whole cannot be deduced from the most complete knowledge you could possibly have of its individual parts.
Okay.
Because it's defined by their relation to each other.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I like that.
But then a problem I have with this is this can only be the case if something known as philosophical zombies can exist. Have you heard of zombies?
Yeah.
So zombies are a way to challenge
the theory of consciousness.
Yes. And it's basically the idea of a human that has the exact same physical attributes and makeup, but lacks consciousness.
Yeah.
And is this possible? Is the debate around zombies.
Yeah. And not only is this possible, but it really challenges us to think about what makes up consciousness. So another good example of philosophical zombies is if you look at computers and a really smart computer, to what extent do we then start considering if it has a consciousness, if it can interact? If it walks like a duck and looks like a duck, then it is a duck.
Yeah.
But I don't think I agree with that statement or theory.
I don't. Yeah. I mean, I don't see how zombies could be possible. I think correct me if I'm wrong, according to materialism though, according to dualism, they believe mind and matter are separate, so zombies should be possible because you can separate out the consciousness.
No, I think the difference is with dualism they require both, and they require them to causally interact. So it can't just be matter and it can't just be mind, it needs to be them both causally interacting. Which does have its own problems, because then you can easily think of things such as, okay, how can a non-physical entity interact with a physical entity? 3 plus 3 can't push a chair. That requires a physical force in order to. So that is an issue with dualism. But one thing that I really like about dualism, which materialists don't account for, is intentionality. So intentionality is the aboutness of something. So a thought is always about something else. I'm thinking about my assignment. I'm thinking about I'm thinking about jazz. It needs to be about something. However, a material thing isn't about anything else. A rock is a rock. The rock is not about something else. So in this way, materialists don't account for again phenomenology as well as thoughts, and by saying that matter is all there is and that the mind doesn't exist, then matter is about matter. How can matter be about anything else? Whereas the mind can be about thoughts, or thoughts can be about something else.
This is interesting in how we can, again, define which organisms are actually conscious.
Yeah.
Because this suggests that the more autonomic an organism is, and the less it interacts with its environment, the less conscious it is. But I feel like this is also quite a human perspective, because we as humans, in a way, interact with our environments more. We interact with each other, and we create thoughts like about jazz.
And we have like a very complex language system.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, I think crossing the threshold of talking about human consciousness and then animal consciousness leads to a lot of ethical conundrums.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Another thing about eliminative materialists is that they argue that neuroscience has surpassed psychological theories and they can essentially replace psychological theories because they can explain our outward behavior. And this again goes back to that thing of simply implementing a neuroscientific vocabulary, such as my amygdala is active, as opposed to actually just saying the emotion you're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And
but also, just on that note, like we can never actually, I mean, maybe in the far future, but we can't like be interoceptive about the neural pathway that's being activated. And again, a huge issue I have with this is like this is just again the language that we use to describe these things.
Yeah.
I just have this huge issue with the limits of our ways of perceiving things and knowing things, and basically the limits of epistemology.
Yeah.
Like,
don't we all?
Yeah, but I think that this is overlooked too often.
Yeah.
So I was reading Chalmers's Consciousness and Its Place in the Brain, where he outlines the main arguments against materialism. So I already talked about Mary's Room and Qualia, and also the idea of zombies and the conceivability of matter and non-material phenomena. But another one is also like what physicality can explain.
Okay, yeah.
Which is related to what you were saying.
Mm-hmm.
So the argument against materialism for dualism is that physical accounts can only explain structure and function.
Ooh.
And I love this because it relates to our structure function episode, and also just something we mention in a lot of episodes.
Yes.
And on top of that, structure and function are not able to explain consciousness, and thus physical accounts cannot explain consciousness. This is how the argument goes.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Makes sense to you?
Yeah.
Does not make sense to me. Because first of all, I think the main problem I have with this is why does structure and function not explain consciousness? Because in our structure function episode, we discussed how the dynamics of systems are related to structure and function, and how it's like a loop of dynamics influences structure, influences function, influences dynamics.
Yeah.
And I believe that from these dynamics between matter, from which structure and function arises, consciousness can also arise.
Okay, so you believe that it's emergent?
Yes, which again links back to the emergent, which you said makes sense.
I think because we don't understand... Okay, because we don't understand how structure and function is actually related, the chicken and the egg kind of thing, I think we can't therefore say base consciousness upon something that we don't know for sure. Having said that, simply not understanding something does not mean that it's not true. It may just speak to our lack of understanding. So I'm like both ways, 50-50 about that.
Yeah. I think a lot of the issue comes down to our inability to know. Right. So looping round back again. I don't know if I'm being too repetitive, but again, like phenomenal experiences are just to me a different way of knowing.
Okay.
Than say learning a fact.
Okay.
And I don't think any one may be more true than the other.
Yeah, I don't think any one may be more true than the other, but I think there's a difference between knowing and understanding and like processing information to experiencing and having a phenomenological experience. I think reading about the wavelengths of a color is very different to seeing the color and perceiving the color red. I think...
Yes, for sure.
I think reading about fear and anxiety is very different from experiencing those feelings.
Yes, I definitely agree with you. I just don't understand why these differences lead to dualism.
I think these differences lead. I think what makes this so different is because I think we can, with a reductive approach, get down to understanding wavelengths. But with a reductive approach, we still can't understand what feelings are.
Mm. Yeah, so which is why it comes down to our ability to approach these scientifically, because the world is actually built on materialism, which I agree is not a good thing. Despite being a scientist, I know we're being very confusing probably here and like contradicting our own life paths.
I feel like maybe science can only go so far. My fascination with tackling subjectivity with science, it's so much fun, but I don't know if it will actually be fruitful. I think there is this epistemological gap. I think there is this hard problem of consciousness that, due to the nature of the problem, will just mean that we'll never have an answer, no matter what scientific methods, no matter what technological advancements. And
I do agree. It's weird how we have different views, but we also keep agreeing on specific points. Yeah.
It's because we make one good point and then the other person says the opposite, and it's like, oh, that logically makes sense as well. So I'm agreeing with that, which I guess just speaks to the complexity and contradictory nature of this problem.
I think we'll wrap up the episode there. Thank you so much for listening to our
confusing rants.
Very confusing thoughts on this topic.
It's such a big topic.
It's a huge topic.
We'll probably talk about it a bit more.
And we'll definitely be focusing our intentionality of our thoughts into this topic every so often.
Yes.
Because we are conscious.
And we experience qualia.
Okay. Be sure to check out our website and interact with our podcast.
We'd love to hear your comments. You can comment on the website.